Wrangel Island lies in the Arctic Ocean between the Chukchi Sea and the East Siberian Sea, far north of the Siberian mainland. It is a long, narrow mass of rock and tundra, roughly 70 miles across at its widest point. For most of the year, sea ice presses against its shores. Even in summer, fog drifts low across the ground and temperatures remain cold. There are no forests. The land rises into low mountains and plateaus, broken by frozen streams and gravel beaches. Wind moves constantly across the open terrain, carrying salt from the sea and snow from the interior. In winter, darkness lasts for months. In summer, the sun circles low above the horizon, never fully setting. Animals adapted to the Arctic live here. Polar bears move along the coast. Arctic foxes follow them, searching for scraps. Walrus gather on the beaches in large groups. Migratory birds arrive during the short warm season to nest in the rocky soil. Human presence has always been rare. Indigenous Chukchi people knew of the island but did not permanently settle it. For centuries, it remained isolated, visited only by occasional explorers and whaling ships. By the early 20th century, Wrangel Island had become a point of interest for explorers and governments seeking to claim Arctic territory. Its remoteness made it difficult to reach, and even harder to survive on without outside support. In 1921, a small expedition arrived on the island, intending to establish a settlement. They carried supplies meant to last until a relief ship returned the following year. The ocean froze behind them. The outside world grew distant. And slowly, Wrangel Island became the only world they knew. The expedition that arrived on Wrangel Island in September 1921 was organized by Canadian Arctic explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson. Stephenson believed the island could support permanent human settlement and might become a strategic outpost in the Arctic. Though Wrangel Island lay off the Siberian coast, its political status was uncertain following the Russian Revolution. Stephenson hoped that establishing a small colony would strengthen territorial claims. 5 people were sent. 4 were young men with limited Arctic experience. Alan Crawford was a Canadian from Winnipeg in his early 20s, who had previously worked with Stephenson. He was chosen to lead the group. Fred Maurer, an American, had some mechanical training but little polar survival knowledge. Lorne Knight, also American, had served in the military during World War I and was recovering from illness. Milton Gow was the youngest, only 18 years old, with no experience in polar regions. The 5th member was an Inuit woman named Ada Blackjack. She had been born in Alaska around 1898 and had grown up in traditional Inuit communities, where hunting, sewing, and survival in harsh conditions were part of daily life. Stephenson hired her primarily as a seamstress and cook. Her knowledge of Arctic living was useful, but she was not presented as a leader. The group traveled by ship across the Arctic waters and was left on Wrangel Island in early September, just as winter approached. They unloaded crates of food, ammunition, tools, and a small prefabricated shelter. The plan was simple. They would live on the island for a year, hunt local animals for additional food, and wait for a relief ship to return in the summer of 1922. Stephenson had assured them that Wrangel Island had abundant wildlife and that survival would be manageable with proper planning. Among the supplies were canned goods, flour, dried meat, rifles, and traps. They also had a small radio, though it was unreliable. There were no guaranteed communication methods once the sea ice closed in. The men had confidence that the plan would work. Crawford believed that following Stephenson's instructions carefully would ensure their safety. They established their base near the southern coast of the island, close to a natural harbor. Ada Blackjack focused on cooking meals, mending clothing, and maintaining the shelter. She was quiet and kept mostly to herself. English was not her first language, and she had joined the expedition mainly to earn money for her young son, who had tuberculosis and was being treated in a hospital in Alaska. As autumn progressed, temperatures dropped quickly. The sea around the island began to freeze solid. By late October, Wrangel Island was cut off completely. The relief ship was expected the following summer. Until then, the 5 settlers were alone. They prepared for winter by stacking food inside the shelter, setting traps for foxes, and hunting seals when possible along the ice edges. Snow soon covered the ground. Daylight shortened with each passing week. At first, life followed a routine. Meals were shared. Shelter repairs were made. Hunting trips were organized. The group believed they had enough supplies to last. They believed the ship would return. But as winter tightened its grip on Wrangel Island, the distance between their small settlement and the rest of the world grew absolute. The winter of 1921 passed slowly. Darkness covered Wrangel Island for long stretches of each day, and storms swept across the frozen land. Snow accumulated around the shelter, and temperatures dropped far below freezing. The group relied heavily on their stored food during the coldest months. Hunting was difficult. Seals were scarce near the shore and polar bears were dangerous to approach. Fox traps provided occasional meat, but not enough to replace their supplies. By early spring of 1922, the sun returned more steadily to the sky. The men expected that the relief ship would soon appear once the ice began to break. Weeks passed. The ice remained thick. No ship came. As summer approached, cracks formed in the frozen sea. Open water appeared in places, but large sections of ice still surrounded the island. The settlers watched the horizon daily. Still nothing. They began to realize that the relief ship had either been delayed or failed to reach them. Their situation changed quietly but completely. The supplies that were meant to last 1 year now had to stretch into an unknown future. Rations were reduced. Meals became smaller. Canned food was carefully counted. The men increased hunting efforts, traveling farther from the shelter in search of seals and birds. Sometimes they returned empty-handed. In late summer they made a decision. 3 of the men, Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer and Milton Gall, would attempt to cross the sea ice toward Siberia once winter returned. Their goal was to reach the mainland and seek help. It was a dangerous plan. The distance was roughly 100 miles across shifting ice and open water. But staying on the island with dwindling supplies seemed worse. Lorne Knight was already ill and weak, suffering from symptoms later believed to be scurvy. He could not travel. Ada Blackjack would remain behind to care for Knight. The group prepared through the early autumn of 1922. They packed limited food and equipment for the journey. When winter returned and the sea refroze, Crawford, Maurer and Gall left the island. They walked into the frozen distance. None of them were ever seen again. Back at the shelter, Ada Blackjack and Lorne Knight were now completely alone. The expedition had collapsed, and Wrangel Island became a place of waiting. After the 3 men departed across the sea ice in late 1922, silence settled over the small camp on Wrangel Island. The shelter held only Ada Blackjack and Lorne Knight. The wind moved across the open tundra, and the frozen ocean stretched outward in all directions. Knight's health continued to decline. His legs were swollen and painful. He struggled to walk even short distances. The signs were consistent with scurvy, caused by a lack of fresh food. Without the men who had done most of the hunting, responsibility for survival shifted almost entirely to Ada. She had not been trained as a hunter. Her role on the expedition had been domestic. But she had grown up in Arctic communities where people depended on animals for food. Though she had little experience using firearms, she began to learn out of necessity. Ada took one of the rifles and practiced shooting at nearby objects until she could hit small targets. Ammunition was limited, so each shot mattered. Slowly she became capable of killing birds and foxes. She trapped Arctic foxes using the equipment the men had left behind. Their fur was saved for warmth. The meat was cooked and eaten. Seabirds were caught when they nested along the rocky slopes during the warmer months. Seals were more difficult. Occasionally one surfaced near the edge of the ice, and Ada would attempt to shoot it from a distance. Success was rare, but when it happened, the meat provided a significant supply of food. She learned how to clean and preserve what she could. Meat was dried in the cold air when possible. Nothing was wasted. Inside the shelter, she organized the remaining supplies carefully. Flour, canned goods, and dried food were rationed in small portions. Each meal was simple and repetitive. Knight was mostly confined to his bed. At first, Ada tried to help him move and encouraged him to eat. As weeks passed, he grew weaker and more withdrawn. His condition worsened steadily. Ada maintained the shelter, sealing gaps where snow drifted inside and repairing damaged sections of the roof. She kept a small stove burning when fuel allowed, melting ice for drinking water. The days followed a pattern. She woke early when light appeared. She checked traps. She searched the shoreline. She prepared food. She tended to Knight. Then she waited. Time became difficult to measure. There was no calendar. The changing light was the only marker of passing months. At some point in the early months of 1923, Knight could no longer speak clearly. His breathing became shallow. Ada continued caring for him, though she had little medical knowledge and no medicine. Eventually Knight died. The exact date is uncertain. He passed quietly in the shelter while Ada was nearby. She was now entirely alone on Wrangel Island. Ada wrapped Knight's body in cloth and moved it outside the shelter. The frozen ground made burial difficult. She covered him with rocks to protect the remains from animals. From that point forward, Ada's survival depended solely on her own effort. She continued hunting and trapping, following the same routine each day. Her skills slowly improved. She became more accurate with the rifle and better at placing traps. Isolation became complete. There were no voices, no movement beyond animals and wind. Occasionally, storms would confine her inside the shelter for days. Snow piled against the walls. The sound of wind was constant. Food shortages were frequent. Some weeks provided enough meat to eat daily. Other weeks brought very little. Hunger was a regular presence. Ada lost weight. Her clothing grew loose. Still, she continued working. She kept records in a small diary, noting the weather and events. Much of what is known about this period comes from her writing. She described long stretches of quiet. She described hunting trips that failed. She described moments of success when she managed to kill a bird or fox. In spring and summer of 1923, birds returned to the island in large numbers. This provided an important food source. Ada collected eggs when she could, careful not to take too many from one nest. She also gathered small plants during the brief growing season, adding them to meals when possible. The environment dictated everything. When storms came, she stayed inside. When animals appeared, she hunted. There was no long-term planning beyond the next meal. Despite her isolation, Ada maintained order in the shelter. Supplies were stacked neatly. Tools were kept in the same places. This routine provided stability. At times, polar bears wandered near the camp. They were large and dangerous. Ada stayed inside when she saw them and avoided confrontation. On one occasion, a bear attempted to approach the shelter. Ada fired a warning shot, and the animal eventually moved away. The rifle became her main protection. The seasons changed again. Another winter arrived. Darkness returned for long periods each day. Hunting became harder. Food supplies thinned. Ada relied heavily on fox meat during the cold months. She continued rationing carefully. There were moments when she feared starvation. Yet she persisted. In the spring of 1924, signs of the outside world finally appeared. The sea ice began breaking earlier than the previous year. Open water formed closer to the shore. One day, while scanning the horizon, Ada saw a small shape in the distance. At first she could not be certain. Over time it grew larger. It was a ship. Although Lorne Knight had already died months earlier, the effects of illness and loss continued to shape Ada Blackjack's experience on Wrangel Island. Knight's death marked the moment when the expedition's original purpose fully ended. The shelter that once held 5 people now held only 1. The physical labor required to survive had not decreased, but the emotional presence of another human being was gone. The silence became constant. Ada's health was strained by limited food and extreme cold. Like the others before her, she showed signs of malnutrition. Her weight dropped significantly. Her hands were often cracked and bleeding from exposure. She experienced fatigue that made even simple tasks difficult. Despite this, she continued hunting daily when weather allowed. There were long stretches when she failed to catch anything. At times she survived on small portions of flour mixed with melted snow, forming thin, tasteless dough. On other days she ate fox meat repeatedly. Fresh food remained rare. Loneliness pressed heavily. With no one to speak to, Ada's only connection to humanity was her diary. She wrote about storms, hunger, and waiting. There are periods in the diary where days are missing, suggesting exhaustion or illness. At one point, she became sick for several days and struggled to leave the shelter. During this time, she had almost no food. When she recovered enough to move, she found one of her traps had caught a fox, which likely prevented starvation. The psychological strain increased as months passed without rescue. Ada did not know whether anyone was still alive beyond the island. She did not know if a ship would ever return. Each day was uncertain. During the summer of 1924, birds once again returned in large numbers. This allowed her to rebuild some strength. Eggs and fresh meat reduced the worst effects of hunger. Still, the constant pressure remained. The weight of isolation was not marked by sudden breakdowns but by slow endurance. There were no dramatic moments. Only continuous effort. The frozen body of Night remained outside the shelter, covered with rocks. Ada avoided that area when possible. The memory of the other men who had left across the ice also remained unresolved. There was no news of them. No signs. The island held their absence. Ada's world was limited to the shelter, the shoreline, and the surrounding hills. Days blurred together. Survival was no longer about waiting for a specific time. It became simply the act of continuing. When another winter approached in late 1924, Ada faced the possibility of being trapped for a third year. Food stores were low again. But before the ice fully closed around the island, The sound of an engine reached the shore. In August 1924, a ship finally reached Wrangel Island. It was sent by Soviet authorities who had become aware of the failed Canadian expedition and intended to assert control over the island. The vessel navigated through broken ice and anchored near the southern coast where the shelter stood. When crew members came ashore, they found the remains of the small settlement and Ada Blackjack living alone. She had survived nearly 2 full years on the island after being left behind. The rescuers also discovered the body of Lorne Knight, still covered with rocks where Ada had placed it. There was no trace of the 3 men who had attempted to cross the sea ice in 1922. It was later assumed that they had perished somewhere between Wrangel Island and the Siberian mainland, though no remains were ever recovered. Ada was taken aboard the ship and given food and medical care. She was weak but conscious. After months of limited nutrition, her body struggled with normal meals at first. The journey back to the mainland marked the end of her isolation. News of the expedition's failure spread quickly. Reports focused on Ada as the sole survivor, often portraying her endurance as unexpected due to her role as the group's seamstress rather than a trained explorer. In reality, it was her knowledge of Arctic life, combined with steady discipline, that had allowed her to survive. The Soviet authorities formally claimed Wrangel Island following the rescue, ending foreign attempts to settle it. Ada Blackjack was eventually returned to Alaska. She reunited with her son who had recovered from illness. Her experience became one of the most documented cases of solitary survival in Arctic history. There was no celebration when she left the island. Only departure. Wrangel Island returned to silence. Ada Blackjack lived the rest of her life in Alaska. She worked in various jobs including cleaning and sewing, and rarely spoke publicly about her time on Wrangel Island. Historians later examined the expedition as an example of early 20th century Arctic overconfidence. Stephenson's belief that the island could easily support settlers proved incorrect. The lack of reliable resupply and the inexperience of most of the team contributed directly to the collapse. Ada's survival was not the result of dramatic rescue efforts or extraordinary equipment. It came from routine, patience, and knowledge of how to live with limited resources in a hostile environment. The 3 men who attempted to cross the ice were never found. Their disappearance remains one of the unresolved elements of the story. Wrangel Island itself continued to be uninhabited except for occasional scientific stations in later decades. The shelter eventually disappeared under snow and weather. What remained was the record of a woman who endured isolation longer than anyone else in the expedition. Her diary stands as the primary account of those months, not as a story of adventure, but as a record of persistence. In the Arctic, survival was not loud. It was quiet, and it was constant.